Welcome to the Solution Nation podcast. My name is Sean Snowday, and I'm the president of Solution Nation. Solution Nation is dedicated to providing a platform for investors to learn about Israel's most dynamic public and private companies. We interview lead venture capitalists, Wall Street analysts, investment bankers, and managers of incubators and accelerators. Today's guest is Andrew Hupert, and the topic is the role of the Maquiladora in the international supply chain. Now, companies considering reshoring to Mexico really should realize that Mexico isn't the same as China. Production can be completely outsourced to China. However, companies that contract with Maquiladoras must provide their own management and secure their own supply chains. Chinese view gaps in the supply chain as an opportunity to profitably solve a problem, while Mexicans view such a situation as an unacceptable risk. Please remember that all content provided on the Solution Nation podcast and website is for educational purposes only. Nothing shall be construed as investment advice. Investment decisions shall not be made based on information, written, verbal, or otherwise, posted or spoken on Solution Nation. Conduct your own research or consult with your own investment advisors before making investment decisions. So here's my good friend, the host of the show, and the CEO of Solution Nation, David Wanatik.
Hello, everyone. This is David Wanatik from Solution Nation. We're going to have a very interesting session today. We're going to talk about Mexico's role in the international supply chain. Speaking on this issue, very pleased to introduce Andrew Hupert, who is a consultant who lives and works in Mexico, where he helps international businesses get their supply chains under control. After over 20 years in Asia, including Shanghai, Taipei, Hong Kong, and Saigon, Andrew decided to follow his own advice and move his operations closer to home. He is now based in Saltillo, Mexico, which is the Detroit of Mexico, where he shows companies how to expand or adjust their supply chains. Andrew, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here. Very excited to have a conversation with you today.
So tell us what a typical engagement looks like for you. What does a client seek from you? What services do you provide?
Okay, most of the people I talk to, most of the people who follow me, first met up with me in China. I go way back in China. I started working with investors in China in the late 1990s, and then I moved to China in 2002. So I was there as a consultant and as a business school professor, helping Western companies learn to negotiate in China back before we were sure that capitalism and free market transactions were going to actually be a thing in China. So around 2006. My client base in China solidified, and that's when we were pretty sure that capitalism was going to be, production was going to make it in China. So that's where I spent most of my early, building my expertise in cross-cultural negotiation. Stayed in China until about 2012. I moved to Thailand along with a lot of my clientele, Thailand and then later Vietnam. But I still was very China-centric in those days. So those are the people I know. The people that I know that are now talking to me about Mexico are the ones that started their production career, started their supply chain careers in Asia, and really don't necessarily know much beyond that. For a lot of people that I talk to, diversifying supply chain meant adding Vietnam or meant adding Thailand. So now that the geopolitical situation has sort of forced us to think outside the box and to think more broadly, people are now coming to me and having discussions about what Mexico has to offer. So that's sort of where I am with most of my clients. We are still moving from 10,000 miles up to a couple of miles up. Most people have not pulled the trigger yet. Well, let's differentiate that. People who don't have a supply chain in Mexico have not pulled the trigger. People who already have part of their existing supply chain in Mexico, mainly the big auto producers, the big aerospace producers, people involved in what we call Maquiladora or shelter production or EMEX production. I'll explain all that stuff. But there are existing programs for US manufacturers to access Mexico's labor force and like Mexico's resources. Those people have been firing on all cylinders. They have been expanding their production in Mexico. They have been moving a lot of their exposure from Asia supply chains to nearshored or reshored supply chains. The people who have not ever done anything outside of China or outside of Asia, they are much slower to pull the trigger. And there are some good reasons for that. The production cycle in Mexico is very, very different from the production cycle in China/Asia. And it's not for everyone. If the people who are most interested, the people who are having the most success and having the best conversations with me about production in Mexico are the ones who have the U.S. as a destination market.
Okay.
If you're going to access the U.S. market, then Mexico makes tremendous sense. If you're trying to just move your existing global supply chain from China to Mexico, you have a couple of hurdles to cross.
Okay.
It's a tougher road.
So we can talk about those hurdles in a minute. So even though a lot of companies haven't actively moved their manufacturing from China to Mexico, there's more interest. Are you getting more inquiries in that? Okay. Sure. So is that driven by the political situation with Premier Xi taking more control? Is it fear of war with Taiwan and maybe other countries will get involved in that? Is it economically driven, or is it the realization that the Chinese market may not be as big as people thought? What are the primary drivers of that renewed concern?
A, B, C, not so much D, but I'm going to add E. Yes to almost everything you said. Definitely politics, definitely Xi, definitely fear of war. Definitely fear of war. I'm going to add actions, okay? I'm not going to, there's still fear of COVID lockdowns and disruptions. And those are huge fears, and fear of moving. Whereas, if I want to visit you in Saigon, or if I want to visit you in Guadalajara, it's about buying a plane ticket. If I want to visit you in Beijing, I've got to check a lot of different regulations, a lot of different rules, and make plans to stay for a certain amount of time in some form of quarantine. That's a business killer. Yeah. You can't do that for years and years, and you can't do it if it's open-ended. I can't tell you that this is going to end anytime soon, and that's what people were hoping for from the last Party Congress, that we would sort of move away from that. We didn't get that in China. So, yes to everything you've said. The situation in China is untenable for a certain type of business. If you are a brand that is trying to produce, but you want to ship your stuff to malls and department stores in the United States, or you want Amazon to deliver your stuff to the United States, you've got to really rethink the China supply chain. Okay. What used to be cheap is not cheap, and what used to be a known quantity is no longer a known quantity. But if you are manufacturing for production, for marketing in Asia, in China, or in Asia, or in parts of Europe, then it still might make a lot of sense. So okay. It's not one size fits all, but there's definitely a lot more concern than there was 3 years ago. Okay,
so for people that are running Japanese, Korean, Australian, New Zealand companies that currently have facilities in China, they may want to move out of China, but not necessarily to Mexico, maybe another place in Southeast Asia. But for those American companies, Canadian companies, Mexico could make a lot of sense. It's obviously much closer geographically. Maybe you can talk to us about the extent of cost savings a company may realize if they move from China to Mexico, or maybe there's areas of the business that would face higher costs of doing business in Mexico versus China.
Okay, that's a great question, and it cuts to let's just cut out a lot of the confusion right now. You're going to hear two sets of numbers about Mexico. Let me just throw you the example. Minimum wage in Mexico. You'll hear two very, very different numbers. One is 173 pesos per day, or $8.71 US per day. You'll also hear another number, which is $16 US per hour. Which one is the real minimum wage in Mexico? They both are. Mm-hmm. If you want to go to a standard, Mexican employment market, which is usually going to be low productivity and in the service industry, a lot of agricultural, a lot of tourism, a lot of basic services, then you're looking at the Mexican minimum wage, which is 173 pesos, or about $8.71 per day. If you want to export to the United States and you want to take advantage of that trade agreement, the U.S. MCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, otherwise known as NAFTA 2, otherwise known as TMEC here in Mexico. But if you want to take advantage of that trade agreement, which you do, then it is closer to $16 per hour, which is USMCA minimum wage.
Okay. And
so that encapsulates the two economies that sometimes confuse people. The ones most of your listeners care about is that USMCA economy, which has a $16 an hour minimum wage.
And I suppose if I don't know how to recruit the employees directly and I want to use the USMCA, and I have to go through an agency, the agency would take an override. So my real cost of paying somebody might be $22, $23 an hour or something like that.
That might be. Good question. I don't want to insert a number that is that high. That's not been my experience. Okay. If you are interested in going to the next step, you probably want a shelter organization. You want to get some sort of shelter agreement. We're going to use the word shelter, Emacs, and Maquiladora pretty much interchangeably because we're just talking about generalities. Let's say that you are an auto manufacturer and you want to move production from China to Mexico with the aim of selling ultimately into the United States. That's where your real value jump is going to come. There are, and you have no exposure to Mexico now, so you're starting from scratch. You are probably going to want to hook up with a shelter organization and make use of this special trade program. Now, the one I use, we'll talk about the specifics in a minute. But the situation I would be involved in would be something in Saltillo or in Monterrey, right near the Texas border. These places are about 200 miles from the Texas border, or from the physical border. The physical border between U.S. and Mexico is about 2,000 miles, and there are at least 25 official POEs, port of entry. So no more of these logistics logjams. You are going to pick your production facility based on logistics. And that's something a shelter organization is going to help you do. They are going to provide you with factory space or production space. They are going to provide you with workers and with all the recruiting, and with all that, they're going to assist with all the supply chain. I mean, with all your supply services, the service supply chain. That's the good news. So, assuming you have a production plant and you have a bill of materials, one of these shelter organizations can set you up within this, I don't want to say special economic zone because it's got a terrible connotation here in Mexico and Latin America. But if you've been doing business in China and you're familiar with special economic zones, don't say SEZ in Mexico, but it's that sort of thing where there's a guy who will take care of everything. Okay. The bad news is that does not include sourcing and supply chain. Supply chain of services, yes. There will be someone to help find you labor, drivers, logistics, accounting, all of those things. There'll be someone to help you with. But in Mexico, you don't get that informal supply chain help where one of your engineers knows another engineer who knows another engineer, and they can make those things happen. I'm thinking Shenzhen. I'm thinking Shenzhen or the special economic zones around Suzhou. That's what they were kind of famous for. They would sort of fill in the gaps in your supply chain in China. That's not a thing in Mexico.
Okay. Okay.
That's a big difference between how the supply chain is going to run in Mexico versus in China.
Okay. So a vulnerability of doing Mexico through a shelter organization in Mexico is they don't help you with the sourcing. So I would have to find my own subcontractors, my own suppliers of the raw materials that I need. And how deep is the ecosystem there? How easy is it to find subcontractors or the raw materials? Do the raw materials still have to come from China or far away?
Great questions, all of them, David. And this is we're now getting into the heart of what is the main challenges for moving your supply chain to Mexico. This is the challenge. Mexico is very distributed geographically. There is not the horizontal kind of networking and cross communication. In China, everything is jammed up in these special zones where everyone talks to everyone else. In Mexico, no one talks to anyone else. That's a big thing here. You don't talk to people in different organizations. So like the example I'm going to use is like Caterpillar. Caterpillar, they've got really deep supply chains. They've got a deep bench in terms of both management and material and even methods. They are really deep in Mexico. But they don't talk to other Mexican producers. Their conversations are with the United States. They are on the US org chart. So that's where all the cross-pollination is taking place. It's within the organization. If you go to China, if you go to Asia, everyone knows everyone, and that's what you hire for, and that's what you encourage. And that's how we, all the Westerners, that's how we all met in China. I met everyone I know either at the American Chamber of Commerce happy hours or the Brit Cham or the Sundowner. That's where we all met. That doesn't really happen so much in Mexico because it's part of the it's part of the US org chart. So that's where your networking is taking place. So if you're coming from the outside, you have to try to access either the supply chain that your ultimate ultimate multinational purchaser. If you're part of the Caterpillar ecosystem, then you're going to try to access that supply chain, that's a source of materials and that source of producers and suppliers. But if you're coming in from the outside, that is definitely a challenge.
So it seems like it's less common or less easy to completely outsource production to Mexico. If I wanted to produce toothbrushes, I could find a manufacturer in China that produce toothbrushes for me. But if I wanted to do that in Mexico, would I be more likely to go to a shelter organization, and then I'd have to be much more specific on the specs, and I have to worry about my own sourcing.
You have to work backwards from your sourcing.
Yeah.
As it stands right now. This full disclosure, this is something I'm working on, and this is something people are working on to change. So I'm giving full disclosure here. But the successful companies, the successful Maquiladora companies are walking in with their own supply chain.
Okay.
Okay. So Caterpillar isn't setting up an operation and then going out and looking for steel and looking for coal and looking for processors. They are walking in with that stuff, with everything in place, including right down to the bill of materials. And I've just come out of a whole series of meetings where there are people who want to do, Mexicans who want to do business with Americans and with multinationals. But there are two problems. One, a lot of American companies are leaving China with the misconception that they know how to operate, that they know how to run a manufacturing company. They don't know how to run a manufacturing company. They know how to order products, but they think that they know how to run a factory, but they don't know how to run a factory. When they go to a place like Mexico, the Mexican the service providers are saying, okay, give me the bill of materials. Give me the schedule of shipments that you have coming in with your with your raw materials and your semi-processed goods and your components, and we'll make all the arrangements. And if the American side says, well, I don't have any of that stuff, it has to be reverse engineered, the Mexicans are going to a challenge. They're heading out to the stairwell with their Chunghwa cigarettes, and they're going to hash it out, and they're going to figure out a way to solve this problem. The Mexicans aren't doing that. The Mexican side is going to say, no, we can't work with this.
Okay.
Because they know that all the American auto producers and all the European auto producers, they have this stuff arranged. They're just expanding out their American operation into Mexico.
Okay. So you cut out for a couple seconds, but I think the main point is you were saying that maybe Chinese are more problem solvers, whereas the Mexicans may not be as dedicated to solving problems.
It has to do with the way they look at risk. The Chinese will look at a gap in the supply chain as an opportunity to use their networking skills. Mm-hmm. Whereas the Mexicans will view a gap in the supply chain as an unacceptable risk that threatens their operation.
It's a very, very nice statement. Very good point. Okay, so that is a problem. There's always risks and problems in doing business, and
it's a challenge, David. It's a challenge for us.
Yeah, it's a challenge, but it's a very important point you brought out. That's just the way it is in life and business. You have challenges, you got to figure out a way to resolve them and not walk away from all the potential problems. Okay, so that's a good point. On that issue, let's talk about the quality of labor. We talked about the cost of labor a bit. How easy are Mexicans to manage or difficult? How assertive are they? How assiduous are they? What's their work ethic like? Are there typically unions that have to be dealt with? And are labor costs going up? In China, they've gone up. What about Mexico?
Okay. Let's focus our conversation on those maquiladora, those auto factories that have, these are brand new factories with the best equipment, and these are the best jobs you can get in Mexico. People are moving within Mexico for these jobs. These jobs are the gateway to the Mexican middle class. Okay, they're good jobs, they're union jobs. People want these jobs. In these kinds of factories, the certifications and all of the rules and having the Toyota method or ISO 9000, this is like a religion. They are so quality conscious and they are so down with the program that it's definitely noteworthy. There's no issue with managing labor. it's a matter of getting the people in and being able to hire the quality of people that you want. People who have been trained in these maquiladora environments understand U.S. factory or let's say Western or standard mainstream. But I'm talking about like U.S. factory codes, U.S. factory behaviors. They check the work board. They know about safety. It is a U.S. factory floor that happens to exist in Mexico. Okay, it is, and just like the U.S. factories that wherever they are, the cost of labor and cost of compliance is going up. These are high, by Mexican standards, these are highly paid jobs. These are $16 a day minimum wage jobs, and it goes up from there. And people want these jobs. So there are the agencies that do the hiring, and there's a lot of transport issues, a lot of union rules. There in the past or up till now, we're just seeing a big shift. Up till now, there has been the big national unions, which are have been in bed with local government and with the U.S. auto companies. These were like company unions. And that there's been a big shift in that lately. There have been two significant cases. Actually, it's been a while ago. But last year, there were two significant cases where Mexican workers fought successfully for the right to develop their own unions, independent of the company, the national unions. But in general, there aren't any big complaints about the quality of labor in the Maquiladora, / EMEX environments. And this is, matched by a big investment in tools and in training. So production levels are quite high in these areas. When you leave these areas, productivity drops off remarkably.
Okay.
So there are two different labor markets. There's the expensive, high quality labor market that is supporting expensive, high quality factories usually in the north. And then there is the low productivity labor that is more common throughout central and southern Mexico.
And the unions, are they Mexican-only unions? Are they extension of the American unions, like the UAW? Is that in Mexico?
I don't know the relationship with UAW, but in the past, the traditional unions are Mexican-only.
Okay.
And they are, they don't really represent the workers as much as they represent the owners. The new unions may have a tie to UAW, but I'm not sure. And that's still a moving target. We don't really have, we haven't seen the end of that story yet. That's still playing out.
But even with the unions, the rate is something like $16 an hour.
Yeah, that's
$16 a day. Right?
That's in the treaty. That's USMCA. That's in the trade agreement.
And that's $16 a day, not an hour.
It's based on the highest minimum wage in any of the three signatory countries.
So are we talking $16 an hour or $16 a day?
$16 an hour, I believe. Hold on, let me check my notes. Yeah, $16 an hour.
An hour. Okay. All right. Is it typical for these shelter organizations to provide dormitories for the workers or cafeterias, or like in China, they almost live, they do live at the factory, or is it more a U.S. type arrangement?
I think it's going to be more of a U.S. type arrangement. There is, I don't know if there are cafeterias. There are cafeteria facilities available, but it's not like China where they're building dorms.
Okay.
They can leave. They're allowed to leave. No, their biggest problem is like providing buses.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
At the shift changes. That's one of the big logistics challenges for the shelter organizations.
Okay. What's the quality of infrastructure like? So the companies have buses, and they're working on the buses to transport their workers back and forth. But when the product is produced, if it's 100 miles away from the U.S. border, how good are the highways to get to the points of entry?
Excellent. That kind of infrastructure is just top notch. These roads are just beautiful. It might even be better than the infrastructure on the other side of the border in some cases. This is Mexico's lifeblood, and these factories. This is a big part of Mexico's economy, and for the most part, they get what they need. So infrastructure is good. The choke points are going to be water. Water is an issue, and sometimes these industries are the victim of a spillover effect of crime. It's not common that there'll be crime directed against factories, but there may be blockages of the roads, shortages based on criminal activity.
Okay.
The factories themselves, no, this has been pretty much hands off.
So that can be a problem if theoretically a company was producing semiconductors, something of value, or cigarettes. There is a risk of the truck being hijacked.
I mean, it's a known risk. Yeah, this exists. It's not particularly. It's been costed in for most of Mexican business.
And are these shelter organizations in these Maquiladoras, are they governed by Mexican law, or is there a special law? Does the U.S. law apply to them if it's a U.S. company?
They are Mexican organizations. In many cases, they're owned. There's some cross-border ownership, but these are Mexican organizations operating in Mexico. Their business specialty is assisting Mexican manufacturing companies to comply with USMCA rules. They will not do custom brokering. They will not do third-party logistics, but they know the people. So one I use, I hope I get the name right. I'm looking up the name right now. The one I do, and again, this is one of these full disclosure things. I'm just getting the name right now because it's something I can never pronounce. Tekawi. Okay. So, Tekawi. So, an organization that I have conversations with a lot is called Tekawi. They are one of these shelter organizations. They are basically in the real estate business. Okay, they will give you a plot of land and all the right connections. When I say connections, I mean natural gas, electricity, air, all the stuff that a factory needs. Water, yes. They are strategically located near highways. Okay, they know why you're there. They do not do the third-party logistics. They do not do, diesel fuel or compressed air, but they know all the people, and all the people know them. So they are not government owned. They are privately owned. They are experts at developing real estate that helps factories comply with USMCA rules, and they know all the people. They do not do sourcing. They do not do manufacturing. So if there are limits to what they can do and what they will do, but they are experts at helping you, the international manufacturing company, comply with these rules.
So the contracts between, let's say, an American company and a Mexican shelter organization, would the contract be written in English or Spanish? And what are the dispute resolution protocols? Is it arbitration in a third country, or is it Mexican law or USMCA law applied, listened to by an American court?
Everything you're doing in Mexico is a Mexican transaction. The idea of this Maquiladora system is they are codifying how international companies are operating in Mexico to take advantage of this set of rules. But you are a Mexican company or you're a Mexican entity dealing with other Mexican entities. And you are a Mexican entity until your shipment crosses the border into the United States. So there may be specialized dispute resolution and arbitration customs, but the official line is everything that happens in Mexico is governed by Mexican law, and you will be expected to have a Mexican entity, whether or not you're using the shelter organization or your own, a facility of your own. This is set up for Mexican entities to deal with one another within Mexico. That being said, a lot of what Mexico does, especially in these within the USMCA, the subject of USMCA transactions, a lot of what Mexico does is set up to favor American investors.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So how good is the English-speaking ability of Mexican managers and supervisors?
In the Maquiladoras section on the border, it's excellent. In many cases, they've gone to school in the United States. I'm trying to learn Spanish. In the South, I get to use my Spanish. In these sections, I do not speak Spanish.
Okay.
They speak English. They speak English with managers in the office and in the factory and in the lawyer's office.
So I suppose when you compare China and Mexico, downside of Mexico is you have to take care of your own sourcing. But the upside is there's much less opportunity for fraud, it seems like, in Mexico. You hear stories like if you want to have a contractor in China, sometimes these Chinese companies, they buy products from the US and they use these as prototypes of what you're going to get. So they have two sets of books, and there's agencies where you can hire actors to go into your factory and act like they work there. So I guess you don't have that in Mexico.
In Mexico, I can't overstate the importance of this. In Mexico, the operation is part of the U.S. organizational chart. Okay, the guy in that Mexico factory has a report to within the factory and another report to in Detroit or in St. Louis. He's on that team, or vice versa. It's not unusual to have a manager in Saltillo have people reporting to him from the U.S. side of the border. Okay, that's how it works here. You're just part of the U.S. organization. You are using the Toyota method or the Caterpillar method or whatever operational method they are using in Michigan and in Arizona and in Texas. You are in the same organization, whereas and you're in the same time zone, on the same calls. In China, it is a 12-hour difference in time, and it is just a different organization. In many cases, it is different laws governing basic operations. So you are operating on your own in China. In Mexico, you are not. You are operating as part of the U.S. operation. It's a completely different mindset, and it leads to different opportunities and different challenges. There's no IP. There's very little IP theft, intellectual property theft. There's very little fraud. There's very little, adulteration of or a diminution of product quality in Mexico.
How do the importation fees, the customs levies, duties differ if you're bringing product from China to the U.S. versus Mexico to the U.S.?
If you are importing, again, it's the same part of the same system. If you're importing from outside of Mexico for production, it's going to be legitimately transformed It's going to, in accordance with USMCA rules. And this is a big one. If you're just slapping a new label on a box, no. You're going to pay full duty on both sides. You're going to pay full duty importing to Mexico and exporting to the United States, and probably face all sorts of other problems if you're just a label slapper. But if you're buying, steel, and you're actually transforming it legitimately into a new product, then you get your duty, your value-added tax is going to be refunded from the Mexicans, and you will not be paying a tariff, or you'll be paying a very low tariff into the United States from the Americans. So Mexico is shaping up to be a legit tax haven for manufacturers. But caveats, David, caveats, 3 caveats. 1, the refund of the VAT is not quick. The Mexicans will refund you, but it's Mexican bureaucracy, and it's worse because they're giving up money and they don't like that. So you may have to wait for your VAT refund. You will get it, but you have to wait. Number 2, that transformation has to be legitimate. It has to be a legit transformation, and they've got rules about that. And people here know what that is, and they know what you mean, and they know how to comply with the rules. Okay? Oh, okay. And then the 3rd caveat is it's all governed. The big tariff reduction is on the U.S. side. So ultimately, your big judge in all of this is on the U.S. Customs and on U.S. Customs side.
Okay. So I suppose if an American company was to wish to operate in Mexico through a shelter organization, then a lot of the negotiating customs and culture, it doesn't really matter that much because you're using them less. You're considering them part of your existing org chart. They speak English. You probably have people who speak Spanish. Are there any customs or negotiating pitfalls that we should be aware of when we work with a shelter organization?
Okay, so I'm going to work again. I'm working backwards from comparing an American negotiating in China and an American negotiating in Mexico. Let's differentiate. Let's just clarify one thing. The shelter organization is one of these. It's a real estate company. You're going to be populating that real estate company. Even if the shelter organization helps you to hire people, they're not, the people are working for you. So you're building your organization. So you're not really negotiating, you're negotiating with the shelter organization as though they are the real estate developer. Okay, now as far as negotiating issues between the US and your Mexican counterparts, what you'll find is that the Mexicans are very, very different from Chinese counterparties in 2 significant ways. 1, Chinese negotiators are famous for their patience. Mexican negotiators are famous for their lack of patience. They are going to make a decision. They're known for their decisiveness. So this is, I characterize Chinese negotiators as patient and market builders. Mexican negotiators are skeptical but decisive. Okay, the Mexican side wants to get an agreement with you, but if they feel there isn't going to be an agreement, they want to walk away early. Whereas the Chinese side feels a quick agreement would be fine. Long-term agreement, also fine, and accessing your entire network and all of your intellectual property while we're negotiating, also fine. So the Chinese side is going to be a lot more patient. They're going to seem to be a lot more expansive, talking about a much wider range of things. They are looking for a way to do business. The Mexican side, you'll find that they are much more decisive. They are going to be much more focused on the up or down of your proposal. If you can't answer all the questions on your proposal, it might be a thumbs down. The Mexican side is not, they want to do the deal. They really want to do business with you. But if they think it's not possible, then that's it for them. They will walk away.
Okay.
So that's one of the big cultural differences you will find. The Mexicans are also not comfortable with loose ends, whereas the Chinese side is.
Okay.
The Chinese side is willing to say, well, we'll come back to that later. Mexican negotiators don't really like coming back to loose ends later.
Yeah, the scope of the negotiations is much narrower if they're, simply, in quotes, providing real estate, water, electricity, and so forth, labor, versus taking on the whole responsibility of producing a product.
Right.
Okay.
They are not factory managers. The shelter organization are not factory managers.
Okay.
You're going to be expected to provide your own factory management.
Okay. Well, good. So for an American company considering doing business in Mexico, being apprised from your guidance that they have to take care of their own supply chain, they have to put in their own management, that's basically an extension of their U.S. operations. It sounds good. Labor is less expensive. Labor quality is good. Infrastructure, roads are good. Duties are very low. Any downsides to operating in Mexico on that basis?
The downsides in Mexico are front-end loaded. If you can set up an operation in Mexico that is, got an adequate supply chain, then you are pretty much good to go. Going forward, once you can establish an operation, I would say you've got three big headwinds that you've got to look out for that are unusual for Mexico. One is environmental issues, meaning business environmental issues, meaning access to water, access to electricity. Those are the big ones. And let's include security as an internal security as issues. These aren't things these are all things that have been costed in for now, but if we're looking for the bad news, that's one of the places I find bad news. Number two, you've got government issues. For the most part, Mexicans are very happy when the government is not in their business. The present administration, the AMLO administration, does not have a lot of fans in business. For the most part, the USMCA rules have been left alone. But in Mexico, we are always looking over our shoulder for issues like nationalization and the government getting involved in businesses. The government has recently gotten involved in the lithium business. The government has recently gotten involved in energy and energy processing business, and this makes us nervous. So that's one of the headwinds I'd be on the alert for. And the other is inflation with Mexican characteristics. So inflation has been hitting Mexico pretty hard, and it has been a little bit dislocating in certain areas. In certain areas, there are shortages. There are land shortages in certain Maquiladora regions. In Monterrey and in Saltillo, it's very hard to get certain types of real estate right now. So those are certain issues I'd be on the lookout for.
So maybe the last question. So is there a real risk of nationalization? So if I was Ford Motors or a company like that and producing cars or parts in Mexico, is there a risk that there could be nationalization? And then secondly, is this whole program of this region 200 miles within the U.S. border, is there any risk that a very left-wing party, socialist or communist, could come to power and want to withdraw from USMC and cancel all of these arrangements?
Okay. Is it possible? Sure. Especially in this environment, anything is possible. And yeah. But is it likely? No. Let me put it this way. If we got to a point where Mexico withdraws from USMCA, you don't want to be here anymore. Okay. It wouldn't be a good environment for you to be. The bad news would have been in the market way in advance of that. So I wouldn't expect anything to affect this trade agreement, anything to harm this trade agreement from this administration or from anyone that's on the horizon. They really like this trade agreement in Mexico. Okay, there's sometimes talk about, nothing's written in stone, but this is as close as we're going to get to an agreement written in stone for Mexico. So I'm not worried about. I'm not worried about the USMCA being the first, the first domino to fall. That would be the last one. So I'm not really that worried about that. No, if you have factories in these Maquiladora regions, especially on the border, I wouldn't worry too much about political or nationalization risk directly. It might be some of the factors in your production, like they're more likely to nationalize they just announced that the government's getting involved in the airline business. So that's a risk that they might start getting involved in transport. But would they nationalize the auto factories? I can't see that happen.
Okay, great. Any final questions or advice you would want to impart to us?
Mexico makes a lot of sense for a lot of companies, and I think you should definitely check it out. But it is not going to be a quick option. So if you're still heavily involved in China or you're overexposed in Asia and you're looking to make some changes, get on this early, because adjusting your supply chain to Mexico is not going to be a quick process. Think in terms of months/years, not in terms of weeks or a couple of months.
Well, it was a very interesting session. We learned a lot about the differences in conducting business in China versus Mexico. You gave us a lot of great insight. I'm sure it's very valuable to a lot of companies considering reshoring their operations closer to the U.S. So, Andrew, thank you very much for speaking to us today.
Thank you, Dave. It was great talking to you, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
So do I.